The massive hall on Zarian Prime was built to impress. Crystal walls stretched up so high that clouds formed near the ceiling. Light from 3 different suns painted rainbow patterns across the floor. Representatives from 47 different alien species sat in seats designed for their unique bodies. Some floated in water tanks, others hung from the ceiling. A few were just glowing balls of energy that hummed when they spoke. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of it all. Its human form looked small and plain compared to the aliens around him. His dark blue uniform was simple, next to their fancy robes and biosuits. But his eyes were steady as he watched the proceedings. It expected this day for months. Ambassador Kethver of the Zephyrian Empire rose from his seat. His tall, thin body moved like flowing water. His skin shifted colors as he spoke, showing his emotions to those who knew how to read them. Right now, the colors showed satisfaction mixed with disgust. Fellow members of the Galactic Council, Kethver began, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. We gather today to address a problem that has plagued our peaceful civilization for 300 years. The humans. Jake felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes turning toward him. Some had multiple eyes. Others had eyes that could see things. Humans couldn't. But they all looked at him with the same expression. They wanted him gone. Dr. Lisa Parker sat in the observation area above the main floor. She was Earth's chief scientist for alien biology. Her red hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her green eyes watched everything carefully. She had studied these aliens for 20 years. She knew their languages, their customs, their ways of thinking. The room as clearly as if it were written in a book. They had already made up their minds. The humans, Kethver continued, have broken 17 major treaties in the past 50 years. They have started 43 diplomatic incidents. They have refused to follow proper procedures in everything from trade to warfare. They question our laws. They ignore our customs. They insist on doing things their own way, even when their way causes problems for everyone else. A low murmur went through the hall. Different species made different sounds when they agreed. Some clicked, others hummed. A few made noises like breaking glass, but they all meant the same thing. Yes, the humans were a problem. Jake remembered some of those incidents. The time human traders had ignored a quarantine because they thought the alien disease wasn't really dangerous. It had been right, but that wasn't the point. The time human colonists had settled on a world without proper permits because the paperwork was taking too long. The world had been empty anyway, but again, that wasn't the point. The time human diplomats had spoken directly to enemy leaders instead of going through proper channels. It had ended a war, but the other species said it wasn't how things were done. The humans claim they are trying to help, said Council Leader Mordith, a being that looked like a walking tree with too many branches. But help that ignores law is not help at all. It is chaos. Lisa watched Jake's face. Didn't show any emotion, but she knew him well enough to see the small signs. The way his jaw tightened just a little. The way his hands stayed perfectly still at his sides. He was angry, but he wouldn't show it. That was very human, too. Other species either showed all their emotions or none at all. Humans were somewhere in between, which the aliens found confusing. We have tried to work with them, added Representative Quilsith of the Merchant Alliance. Her voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. We have offered them guidance. We have provided them with proper procedures. We've been patient, but they continue to act as if rules don't apply to them. Jake wanted to laugh, but he didn't. Rules. The aliens loved their rules. They had rules for everything. Rules for how to say hello. Rules for how to trade goods. Rules for how to fight wars. Rules for how to explore new worlds. Rules for how to make new rules. Humans followed the important rules, the ones that made sense. But they didn't see why they needed to fill out Form for 7B in triplicate just to deliver medical supplies to a planet with a plague. Engineer Amy Brooks was back on Earth, watching the proceedings on a screen. She sat in the command center for the Colonial Evacuation Project. Around her, dozens of people worked at computers and communication stations. They were already preparing for what everyone knew was coming. Amy was 35 years old and had spent half her life building things in space. She had helped design the jump gates that let ships travel between stars quickly. She had built space stations that could house millions of people. She had turned dead rocks into living worlds. Now she was planning how to tear it all down and bring everyone home. The question before us today, said Kethver, is simple. Can the Galactic Council continue to function with humanity as a member? Can we maintain peace and order while one species refuses to accept civilized behavior? Lisa knew the answer. She had known it before the session even started. The vote had been decided in private meetings weeks ago. This was just for show, to make it look official and fair. The human response to every situation is the same, said Admiral Hexara of the Defense Coalition. Her species looked like giant insects, but they were among the most peaceful beings in the galaxy. They escalate. They break things. Act first and think later. This is not the way of civilized peoples. Jake finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the hall. We get results. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several alien representatives made shocked noises. It was incredibly rude to speak without being asked. But Jake didn't care about that rule either. The Kethmari Civil War lasted 800 years, Jake continued, his voice still calm and level. Human mediators ended it in 6 months. Zephyrian trade dispute had been in committee for 2 centuries. Human negotiators solved it in 3 weeks. The Void Raiders had been terrorizing the Outer Rim for 50 years. Human forces stopped them in a single campaign. By breaking every rule of civilized warfare, Hexara shot back. By using tactics that were brutal and unpredictable, but effective, Jake said. That was the problem, Lisa thought. Humans were effective, they got things done. But they did it in ways that made the other species uncomfortable. The aliens had spent thousands of years developing their careful, polite, rule-following civilization. Then humans had shown up and proven that many of those rules weren't actually necessary. President Frank Coleman was in his office in Washington. Watching the feed from Zarian Prime, he was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had been trying to keep humanity in the Galactic Council for his entire presidency. Now he was watching it all fall apart. His Secretary of State, Maria Santos, stood beside his desk. Sir, we should probably start the evacuation procedures. This isn't going to go our way? Frank nodded slowly. How long will it take? Amy Brooks estimates 60 days for a complete withdrawal. We have 12 million citizens in the colonies, plus all the infrastructure and equipment we'll need to bring back. 12 million people, Frank said quietly. 300 years of expansion. All of it ending because we don't follow their rules. The vote was announced exactly as everyone expected. 47 species voted yes. 0 voted no. 0 abstained. Humanity was expelled from the Galactic Council. They had 60 standard days to withdraw all their people and ships from beyond the Sol system. After that, all borders would be closed. All trade would end. All communication would cease. Jake listened to the formal declaration without expression. Humanity was declared too dangerous for civilized space. Too unpredictable. Too willing to break established order. They were being sent home like children who couldn't behave in school. When it was over, Jake walked out of the hall without saying another word. Lisa met him at the shuttle bay. Amy was already coordinating with Earth for the massive job ahead. Frank was preparing to address the nation. Humanity was going home. The galaxy was finally going to have the peace and order it wanted. They just had no idea what they were giving up. 5 years had passed since the Great Evacuation. The galaxy called it the Great Quiet because for the first time in 3 centuries, there were no human voices causing trouble in council meetings. No human ships breaking formation protocols. No human diplomats asking uncomfortable questions or suggesting changes to ancient traditions trade. Inspector Veltar of the Aquatic Collective floated in his water tank office. Reviewing quarterly shipping reports on his holographic display, the numbers glowed blue in the water around him, showing cargo movements across 17 star systems. Something was wrong, but it had taken him months to figure out what. Shipping delays were up 12% across all major trade routes. What used to take 3 weeks now took 4. Deliveries that once arrived early now showed up late. The carefully planned schedules that had worked for centuries were falling apart piece by piece. Veltar called up the historical data from 6 years ago, before the humans left. The shipping network had been different then. Human courier ships had filled the gaps between the major trade routes. Their ships were smaller and faster than the massive freighters used by other species. More importantly, they had been unpredictable. While other species followed the same routes at the same times every cycle, human ships had gone wherever they were needed. They had taken shortcuts through dangerous space that other captains wouldn't risk. They had carried emergency supplies to worlds that weren't on any regular shipping schedule. They had made the whole system more flexible without anyone really noticing. Now the gaps were showing. Minor worlds that had depended on human supply runs were having shortages. Emergency deliveries took days longer because no one wanted to risk the dangerous shortcuts. The entire shipping network had become rigid and slow. On the scientific world of Academia 7, Dr. Salandra stared at her research terminal with growing frustration. She was one of the galaxy's leading experts on quantum mechanics, with 17 advanced degrees and honors from every major university. Her current project should have been completed months ago, but she was stuck. The problem wasn't lack of knowledge. The Galactic Research Network had more information than ever before. Scientists from 47 species shared their work freely. Every experiment was documented. Every theory was peer-reviewed. Everything was orderly and proper and completely predictable. That was the problem. Every approach to her research question followed the same logical patterns. Elegant and mathematically beautiful, but none of them actually worked. She needed a different perspective, a new way of thinking about the problem. She remembered the human researchers who used to work on Academia 7. They had been frustrating colleagues. Their methods were messy and unscientific. They tried things that shouldn't work. They asked questions that seemed irrelevant. They approached problems from angles that made no mathematical sense. But they had also made breakthrough discoveries at a rate that amazed everyone. While other scientists spent years developing perfect theories, humans would stumble onto working solutions through pure trial and error. Their success rate had been incredible, even if their methods were embarrassing. Dr. Salandra pulled up the research statistics for the past 5 years. The rate of major discoveries had dropped by 60%. Projects that should have taken 2 years were now taking 5. The careful, methodical approach that all civilized species preferred was producing careful, methodical results. But it wasn't producing innovations, Commander. Zikdos of the Hegemony Defense Force reviewed intelligence reports in his office aboard the battle station. Dark Star. The holographic displays around him showed ship movements throughout the Outer Rim territories. Red dots marked pirate attacks. There were a lot more red dots than there used to be. Pirate activity had increased by 40% in the past 3 years. The raiders were getting bolder, attacking larger targets and staying in the same areas longer. They seemed to know exactly where the Defense Force patrols would be and when. That made sense, because Defense Force patrols followed the same patterns they had used for 800 years. Every species had agreed on these patrol routes through centuries of careful negotiation. They were mathematically optimal, covering the maximum area with the minimum number of ships. They were also completely predictable. Zikdos remembered how much the Defense Force commanders had complained about human patrol fleets. Human ships never followed the agreed routes. They showed up in random systems at random times. They chased pirates through dangerous asteroid fields and nebulae where proper warships wouldn't go. They used tactics that were considered undisciplined and chaotic. But pirates had been terrified of them. You never knew where a human patrol might appear. Their ships were fast, and their crews were willing to take risks that other species considered insane. A pirate might plan a raid perfectly, only to have a human destroyer drop out of hyperspace right on top of them. Now the pirates knew exactly where Defense Force ships would be. They could plan their attacks with perfect timing. The orderly patrol. Patterns that looked so good on paper were useless against enemies who could read a schedule. On Merchant's Haven, The galaxy's largest trading hub, Port Administrator Quiln, was dealing with a crisis that nobody wanted to talk about. Her species looked like giant flowers that could walk, and she had been managing the port for 30 years. She had never seen anything like the current situation. Innovation permits were down by 30%. New products, new services, new technologies, new ideas, the flow had slowed to a trickle. The humans had been responsible for 40% of all innovation permits in the past century. But it was more than just their absence. The entire culture of innovation was disappearing. Other species had relied on humans to come up with crazy, new ideas. When those ideas worked, other species would improve them and make them practical. It had been a good system. Humans provided the chaotic creativity, and everyone else provided the careful refinement, but without humans constantly suggesting new possibilities. Everyone else had settled into comfortable routines. Why risk trying something new when the old ways worked fine? Why invest in research when there were no disruptive human innovations forcing change? The port's merchant quarter, once buzzing with inventors and entrepreneurs, was now filled with the same old shops, selling the same old products. The excitement was gone. The sense of possibility was gone. The galaxy was becoming stagnant. Meanwhile, in the Sol system, humanity had gone completely silent. Long-range sensors showed some activity around Earth and the other human worlds. But no details. No ships ventured beyond the heliopause. No radio signals escaped the system. No automated beacons marked safe passage routes. It was as if 12 million humans had simply vanished from the universe. Admiral Ixara of the Defense Coalition tried not to think about the humans too often, but sometimes she couldn't help it. Her species had evolved from insects, and they understood the value of following patterns and maintaining order. The humans had driven her crazy with their chaotic behavior, but now she found herself wondering what they were doing in their isolated system. Were they struggling to survive without galactic trade? Were they fighting among themselves without external threats to unite them? Were they slowly reverting to the primitive state they had been in when first contact was made? Or were they planning something?
Ow.
The thought made her uncomfortable. Humans were unpredictable when you could see them. When you couldn't see them at all, they became terrifying. Her reports to the Defense Coalition always ended the same way. No activity detected in Sol system. Situation appears stable. But she always added a private note. Recommend continued monitoring. Back on Zarian Prime, Ambassador Kethfer reviewed the quarterly reports from across the galaxy. Everything looked good on paper. Crime was down in the core worlds. Diplomatic incidents were at an all-time low. Trade disputes were being resolved through proper channels. The Galactic Council hadn't had a single emergency session in 2 years. Peace and order had finally been achieved. The disruptive element had been removed. Civilization could advance at its own pace without constant interruptions from species that didn't understand how things were supposed to work. But something felt wrong. The galaxy was quieter than it had been in centuries. Not just because human voices were gone from the council chambers. Everything was quieter, calmer, more predictable. Kethfer pushed the feeling aside. This was what they had wanted. This was what they had worked for. The humans were gone, and the galaxy was better for it. He just wished he could shake the feeling that they had lost something important along with the chaos. 10 years after humanity's expulsion, the galaxy faced something it hadn't experienced in over 1,000 years, a crisis it couldn't solve. The Void Plague had emerged from the galactic core 3 months ago. It wasn't a disease in any normal sense. Star systems simply became uninhabitable. Planets would lose their atmospheres overnight. Space stations would go dark without warning. Ships entering affected areas would vanish completely, leaving no trace behind. Chief Medical Officer Torwin of the Galactic Health Authority floated in his medical bay aboard the research vessel Healing Light. His species looked like jellyfish that could live in space, and his transparent body pulsed with worried colors as he studied the latest reports. 6 star systems had been consumed so far. The plague spread along the major hyperspace routes following the same predictable paths that ships used for centuries. Every attempt to contain it had failed. Traditional quarantine methods were useless because the plague didn't follow any. Biological rules. Torwin remembered the human doctors who had once worked alongside him. They had frustrated him with their crude methods and aggressive treatments. Where his people used gentle healing techniques refined over millennia, humans would try dangerous experimental procedures, where civilized medicine was careful and precise. Human medicine was brutal and direct, but human doctors had also cured diseases that had puzzled the galaxy for centuries. They approached problems differently, trying solutions that seemed impossible. They were willing to risk everything on treatments that shouldn't work but somehow did. Now, facing the Void Plague, all of the galaxy's careful medical knowledge was useless. The elegant solutions that had worked for thousands of years meant nothing against something that operated outside normal physics. Torwin found himself wondering what a human doctor would try. Probably something completely insane that might actually work. Admiral Hexara commanded the joint fleet tasked with containing the plague spread. 150 ships from 12 different species formed perfect geometric patterns around the affected areas. The formations were beautiful to see, mathematical precision made real in the darkness of space. They were also completely ineffective. The plague seemed to anticipate every move the fleet made. When they established a containment perimeter, the plague would spread in a different direction. When they tried to block hyperspace routes, the plague would find alternate paths. Every strategy developed by the finest military minds in the galaxy was countered within days. Hexara stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching another star system begin to die. Her insect-like features showed the strain of constant failure. The fleet followed every protocol perfectly. They executed every maneuver with precision. They did everything exactly as military doctrine required. That was the problem. Human military units had never followed proper doctrine. Their formations looked random and chaotic. Their tactics made no sense to trained officers. They would attack when they should retreat, scatter when they should form up, take risks that no sane commander would consider. But enemies could never predict what humans would do next. Human unpredictability had been their greatest weapon. Now facing an enemy that seemed to read their every move, the galaxy's perfectly organized military was helpless. On the research station, Insight Prime, lead scientist Dr. Nelseth worked desperately on a solution. The station held the galaxy's most advanced laboratories and its greatest minds. Representatives from every major species contributed their knowledge to the effort. Dr. Nelseth's species had evolved from creatures that looked like walking crystals. Her thought processes were logical and precise. She approached every problem systematically, breaking it down into manageable parts and solving each piece in order. The Void Plague refused to be broken down. Every time they thought they understood one aspect of it, 3 more mysteries would appear. Their careful experiments produced data that made no sense. Their elegant theories fell apart when tested against reality. She had been working on the problem for 2 months without progress. The galaxy's most sophisticated instruments could barely detect the plague, let alone understand it. Their most advanced computers couldn't model something that seemed to change its own rules constantly. Dr. Nelseth found herself thinking about the human researchers who had once worked on Insight Prime. They had been the worst kind of scientists from her perspective. They would skip steps in their experiments. They would test multiple variables at once. They would try solutions before they fully understood the problem. It had been maddening to watch. But they had also made discoveries that proper research methods couldn't achieve. They would stumble onto answers through sheer trial and error, then work backwards to figure out why their solutions worked. Maybe that was what the galaxy needed now. Someone willing to try impossible things just to see what happened. Economic. Minister Yurgas watched the galactic economy begin to collapse from his office on the financial world of Commerce Central. His species looked like walking trees, and his bark-like skin had developed stress patterns that his doctors said were dangerous. The Void Plague wasn't just consuming star systems. Fear of the plague was destroying trade networks across the galaxy. Shipping companies refused to use the major hyperspace routes. Colonies were demanding emergency supplies that couldn't be delivered. Entire sectors were cutting themselves off. From galactic commerce to avoid contamination, The carefully maintained supply chains that had fed the galaxy for centuries were breaking down. Each species had specialized in producing certain goods, trading with others for everything else. It was an efficient system that worked perfectly when everything ran smoothly, but it was also fragile. When trade routes became unreliable, shortages appeared everywhere. Worlds that had depended on imported food were facing starvation. Industrial centers couldn't get the raw materials they needed. The entire economic structure was collapsing like a house of cards. Yurgas remembered the human trade networks. They had seemed wasteful and inefficient to economic experts. Humans maintained multiple suppliers for everything, stockpiled goods that might be needed someday. They built redundant systems that cost more but could survive disruptions. Other species had criticized human economic methods as primitive and wasteful. Now, watching the galaxy's efficient economy crumble, Yurgas realized that the humans had been preparing for exactly this kind of crisis. Refugee fleets streamed toward the inner sectors of the galaxy, carrying millions of beings who had fled the plague zones. The Galactic Council had never planned for mass evacuations on this scale. Their emergency procedures were designed for small, localized disasters. Ambassador Kethfer stood in the council chambers, watching representatives argue about refugee quotas and resource allocation. Every species wanted to help, but they also wanted to protect their own worlds. The careful diplomatic balance that had maintained peace for centuries was breaking down under the pressure. Some species were sealing their borders completely. Others were accepting refugees, but demanding impossible payments. The unity that had seemed so strong was revealing itself to be shallow and fragile. Kethfer thought about the human response to refugee crises in the past. They had been criticized for taking in anyone who needed help, regardless of the cost. They had opened their worlds to aliens who had nowhere else to go. They had shared their resources with species that couldn't pay them back. Other species had called it foolish generosity. Kethfer wondered if it had been wisdom instead. The humans had understood something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten, that survival sometimes required sacrifice. Deep in the Sol system, humanity remained silent. No signals escaped their home system. No ships crossed the heliopause. Long-range sensors detected some activity, but nothing that revealed what 12 million humans were doing with their isolation. The silence was becoming more frightening than any threat. Everyone knew that humans were unpredictable. When you couldn't see what they were doing, they became terrifying in their possibilities. Some council members suggested sending a probe to the Sol system, just to see if humanity still existed. Others argued that contact with them might spread the plague to human space. A few quietly wondered if the humans might have a solution to the crisis that was destroying galactic civilization. But no one was ready to admit that they had made a mistake 10 years ago. No one wanted to acknowledge that the chaotic, disruptive, rule-breaking humans might be exactly what the galaxy needed to survive. The Void Plague consumed another star system, and the galaxy's careful civilization moved one step closer to collapse. 15 years had passed since humanity disappeared into the Sol system. Now, the galaxy was dying, and Ambassador Kethfer found himself on a ship heading toward the one place the Galactic Council had sworn never to visit again: the exploration. Vessel Silent Approach moved carefully through the outer edges of the Sol system. Kethfer stood on the bridge, his color-changing skin showing patterns of fear and desperate hope. Behind him, representatives from 6 other species watched the sensor displays with growing amazement. They had expected to find a broken civilization. 12 million humans trapped in a single star system, cut off from galactic trade and technology. They had imagined finding primitive settlements struggling to survive, perhaps even fighting wars among themselves. The galaxy's experts had predicted that humanity would collapse within a decade without outside support. Instead, they found something impossible. The Sol system had been transformed into something beyond recognition. Massive orbital stations ringed every planet, including worlds that had been barren rocks 15 years ago. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter pulsed with energy signatures that their sensors couldn't identify. Streams of ships moved between installations in patterns that made no sense but somehow seemed purposeful. Captain Ben Foster responded to their hail from the bridge of a station orbiting Earth. The humans had been expecting them. That alone was disturbing, since the silent approach was using the most advanced stealth technology in the galaxy. Ben appeared on their main screen, looking older than Kethfer remembered, but completely calm. His hair had gone gray, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of hard decisions and sleepless nights. But he seemed relaxed, even friendly. Ambassador Kethfer, Ben said with a slight smile. It's been a long time. What brings the Galactic Council to our little corner of space? Kethfer tried to maintain his diplomatic composure, but the question caught him off guard. The humans weren't supposed to know about the Void Plague. The Sol system had been completely isolated. No information should have reached them about the crisis destroying galactic civilization. We come seeking dialogue, Kethfer said carefully. The galaxy faces certain challenges that might benefit from a human perspective. Ben's smile widened slightly. Challenges. Is that what you're calling the Void Plague now? The bridge of the silent approach fell completely silent. Dr. Rachel Stone appeared beside Ben on the screen. She had been Earth's director of xenological studies before the expulsion, and she looked exactly as calm as Ben did. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same practical style she had always favored, and her brown eyes showed the sharp intelligence that had always made other species nervous. We've been watching, Rachel said simply. We know about the 23 star systems you've lost. We know about the refugee crisis. We know about the economic collapse and the military failures. We know about the research teams that can't find solutions and the politicians who can't maintain unity. How? Asked Dr. Salandra, who had joined the expedition as the galaxy's leading expert on the plague. Your system has been completely isolated. Rachel and Ben exchanged a look that somehow conveyed entire conversations. It was the kind of silent communication that humans were famous for, the ability to share complex thoughts without words. Other species found it unsettling. We've had 15 years to develop new capabilities, Rachel said. Isolation has certain advantages. General Chris Martinez appeared on the screen beside them. He was Earth's new defense commander, a position that hadn't existed before the expulsion. His uniform was different from anything the galaxy had seen. The insignia on his shoulders meant nothing to galactic military experts. The question is, Chris said, why should we help? You made it very clear 15 years ago that humanity was too dangerous for civilized space. What's changed? The words hung in the space between the ships like an accusation. Kethfer felt the weight of his fellow representatives' eyes on him. They had come hoping to find humans desperate enough to help without conditions. Instead, they found humans who clearly understood their position of strength. The plague threatens all life in the galaxy, said Admiral Hexara, who had joined the mission despite her misgivings. Surely that includes humanity. Ben shook his head slowly. The Void Plague follows hyperspace routes, spreads along the network of jump gates that connect the galaxy. We've been isolated from that network for 15 years. The plague can't reach us. That revelation hit the expedition like a physical blow. The humans weren't just safe from the plague. They had been safe all along. Their isolation, which the galaxy had intended as punishment, had become their protection. You could help us contain it, Dr. Salandra said, her crystal-like features flickering with desperate hope. Your research methods, your different approach? Two problems, ... Our chaotic, disruptive, rule-breaking approach, Rachel asked with raised eyebrows. The same approach that got us expelled from civilized space? Dr. Paul Davis appeared on the screen, joining the growing group of human leaders. He was older now, his engineer's uniform showing the wear of hard work, but his eyes were bright with intelligence. He had been designing starships when the humans left. Now he seemed to be designing something much larger. We've actually solved the Void Plague problem, Paul said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. Figured it out about 3 years ago. The solution is pretty straightforward once you understand what you're dealing with. The aliens on the silent approach stared at the screen in shock. The greatest crisis in galactic history, the threat that was destroying their entire civilization, and the humans had solved it 3 years ago. But here's the thing, Paul continued. Our solution requires a complete change in how you do everything. Military tactics, trade routes, research methods, political structures. Everything that makes your civilization civilized has to change. Explain, Kethfer demanded, his diplomatic training finally failing him. Rachel leaned forward slightly. The void plague isn't really a plague. It's a response mechanism. The galaxy's hyperspace network has been used the same way for thousands of years. The same routes, the same patterns, the same predictable behaviors. The network developed an immune response to eliminate what it saw as an infection. Impossible, Dr. Solandra protested. Hyperspace is just folded space-time. It can't be alive, can't it? Ben asked. You've been treating the galaxy like a machine for so long that you forgot it might be something more. Humans never made that assumption. We've been studying the network differently, approaching it as if it were a living system. The solution, Paul said, requires ships to travel in random patterns, routes that change constantly. Military formations. That make no sense? Research approaches that try impossible things? Economic systems that maintain redundancy even when it seems wasteful? Political structures that can handle chaos and uncertainty? In other words, Chris added, you need to start acting like humans. The irony was almost too much to bear. The galaxy had expelled humanity for being too chaotic and unpredictable. Now they needed chaos and unpredictability to survive. Will help, Rachel said quietly. But not on the old terms. We're not going back to being junior members of a galactic civilization that doesn't value what we bring. If we do this, we do it as partners. What are you asking for? Kethfer said. Respect, Ben said simply. Recognition that different doesn't mean wrong. Acceptance that chaos isn't always bad and order isn't always good. Placing galactic civilization that values our perspective instead of trying to suppress it. Kethfer looked at his fellow representatives. He could see the struggle in their faces. Everything they believed about proper civilization was being challenged. But their alternative was extinction. How quickly can you implement your solution? He asked. Rachel smiled for the first time since the conversation began. We've been ready for 3 years. The question is how quickly you can change everything you think you know about running a galaxy. The humans waited patiently for an answer. They had learned, during their 15 years of isolation, that sometimes the best strategy was simply to wait for others to realize what they needed. The negotiations took place aboard the human station orbiting Earth. Ambassador Kethfer found himself in a conference room that looked nothing like the crystal halls of Zarian Prime. The walls were made of simple metal. The chairs were built for function, not beauty. Everything about the room spoke of practicality over elegance, but the technology humming beneath. The surface was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Dr. Rachel Stone sat across from the alien delegation, her hands folded calmly on the table. Beside her, Captain Ben Foster and General Chris Martinez waited patiently as the galactic representatives struggled with what they were hearing. You want us to abandon our entire way of life, said Dr. Solandra, her crystal features flickering with distress. Thousands of years of civilization thrown away for chaos. Not chaos, Rachel corrected gently. Flexibility, the ability to adapt when your careful plans don't work. The willingness to try new things when old methods fail. Engineer Paul Davis activated a holographic display in the center of the table. The image showed the galaxy's hyperspace network as humans now understood it. Instead of the static routes that other species saw, the display showed a living, breathing system that responded to patterns and rhythms. The void plague isn't destroying star systems, Paul explained. It's the network's immune system trying to eliminate what it sees as a viral infection. Your predictable travel patterns, your rigid trade routes, your systematic exploration schedules. The network reads all of that as a single, massive parasite. Admiral Hexara studied the display with growing understanding. But if we change our patterns randomly, the network sees diversity instead of infection, Chris confirmed. Multiple small entities instead of one giant parasite. The immune response shuts down. It's already working, Ben added. We've been testing the theory for 3 years. Small human ships have been slipping out of the Sol system and moving through plague zones. The network doesn't react to us because we don't follow predictable patterns. Kethfer felt a chill run through his color-changing skin. You've been leaving the Sol system? "You've been in our space?" "Only to test our theories," Rachel said calmly, "and to observe how the crisis was developing. We needed to understand the full scope of the problem before we could offer solutions." The revelation that humans had been moving freely through galaxy while everyone believed them trapped was disturbing. But it was also proof that their solution worked. "Show us," Kethver said finally. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded the Joint Human Galactic fleet that launched 3 days later. Her ship, the Defiance, led a formation that would have horrified military experts just weeks ago. 30 vessels from 8 different species flew in patterns that seemed completely random. Human tactical doctrine had been given to every ship captain, but most of the alien crews struggled to implement it. Where they wanted to maintain neat formations, humans told them to spread out randomly. Where they wanted to follow established routes, humans insisted on constant course changes. Where they wanted to coordinate their movements, humans demanded independence and improvisation. Lisa watched from her bridge as Admiral Hexara's flagship tried to execute a human-style maneuver. The insect-like admiral was clearly fighting every instinct her species had developed over millennia of careful military organization. "Random doesn't mean without purpose," Lisa said over the communication channel. "Think of it like a school. Of fish, each individual moves independently, but the group responds as a unit. It took time, but gradually the fleet began to move like humans thought. Ships would break formation suddenly, then regroup in unexpected patterns. They would change course without warning, then coordinate their movements through rapid communication. Bursts, instead of careful planning, as they approached the edge of the plague zone. Sensors showed the familiar signs of system death. Planets stripped of their atmospheres, space stations dark and lifeless. The void between stars seemed darker than it should be. But as the fleet moved deeper into the affected area, something unprecedented happened. The plague stopped spreading. Systems that had been dying began to stabilize. The darkness between stars seemed to lighten. "It's working," Dr. Salandra whispered from her position aboard the science vessel Discovery. "The network is responding to our presence as individual entities instead of a single threat." The fleet spent 2 weeks in the plague zone, the random movements creating a pattern that the hyperspace network could accept. Slowly, the immune response that had been destroying star systems began to shut down. The void plague wasn't being cured, it was simply stopping. Back on Zarian Prime, the Galactic Council faced the most difficult decision in its history. The human solution worked, but implementing it galaxy-wide would require changes that challenged everything they believed about civilization. Trade routes that had been stable for centuries would have to become random and flexible. Military formations that had been perfected over millennia would have to be abandoned for chaotic human tactics. Research methods that had produced steady progress would have to make room for wild experimentation. Most difficult of all, the careful diplomatic balance that had maintained peace for thousands of years would have to change. The Council would need to accept humanity not as a junior member to be managed, but as an equal partner whose perspective was essential. "They're asking us to become like them," said Council Leader Mordith, his tree-like form swaying with agitation.
"Oh."
Kethver replied, having spent weeks in negotiation with human leaders. "They're asking us to make room for their way of thinking alongside our own. They're not trying to eliminate our civilization. They're trying to save it." The vote was closer than anyone expected. 24 species voted to accept the human terms. 21 voted against. 2 abstained, by the narrowest possible margin. The galaxy chose survival over pride. Dr. Rachel Stone returned to Zarian Prime for the first time in 15 years. The crystal halls looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Human representatives sat beside alien ambassadors. Military advisors from Earth worked with galactic defense forces. Human scientists collaborated with research teams across the galaxy. Most importantly, human voices were heard in council debates again, not as disruptive elements to be managed, but as essential contributors to galactic civilization. The changes weren't easy. Many species struggled to adapt to human-style thinking. Economic systems had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Military doctrines developed over millennia had to be thrown out and replaced with adaptive strategies. Research programs had to make room for the messy, chaotic methods that humans preferred. But it worked. The Void Plague became a historical curiosity. Trade networks became more resilient and efficient. Scientific discoveries accelerated as researchers learned to combine careful methodology with wild experimentation. Military forces became more effective as they learned to be unpredictable. Captain Jake Morrison, now promoted to admiral, stood on the bridge of his flagship as it patrolled the former plague zones. His hair was white now, and his face showed the lines of a man who had lived through historic changes. But his eyes were bright with satisfaction. The galaxy was messier than it had been 15 years ago. Ships traveled in patterns that made no logical sense. Trade routes changed constantly. Research projects pursued impossible theories alongside practical applications. Council debates were louder and more chaotic than they had been in centuries. But the galaxy was also more alive than it had been in 1,000 years. Innovation flourished. Problems were solved faster. Crises were handled with flexibility instead of rigid procedures. The careful, predictable civilization that had nearly died was replaced by something more dynamic and resilient. Rachel Stone stood in her new office on Academia 7, watching human and alien researchers work together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Through the window, she could see ships launching on missions that followed no predetermined routes, carrying crews that would adapt to whatever they found. The galaxy had learned. At almost the cost of its own existence, that true civilization, it wasn't about eliminating chaos. It was about finding the right balance between order and flexibility, between tradition and innovation, between predictability and adaptation. They had discovered too late what they had given up when they let humanity leave. But they had discovered it just in time to save themselves. The stars burned brighter now, reflecting the light of a civilization that had learned to embrace the very chaos it had once feared. And in the depths of space, the hyperspace network hummed with the healthy rhythms of a living system that no longer saw its users as a threat to be eliminated, but as a diverse community to be supported.